The first thing Caleb Rourke noticed was the way her voice broke. Not loud, but thin as a frayed rope about to part. And in that brokenness, there was a plea that cut deeper than any knife he'd ever carried. Because when she whispered, "Please, take them off," it wasn't command or pride speaking. It was something stripped raw by dust and pain and long days of being less than human. And the desert around them seemed to lean in to listen as the sun burned low over the alkali flats, staining the color of dried blood, while she stood bent forward with her wrists bound and a coarse sack hanging from her neck like a curse, her face swollen and darkened by bruises that told a story. No one had bothered to finish kindly, and Caleb, a rancher who had buried 2 sons and a wife and thought himself emptied of surprise, felt his chest tighten as if fate itself had reached in and closed its hand around his heart. He had found her hours earlier stumbling near his fence line, chased by nothing and everything at once, and the man who had dragged her there, some hired shadow from a smaller, meaner life, had fled at the sight of Caleb's rifle, leaving behind silence and the slow wheeze of her breath, and now the horses shifted behind them, uneasy, sensing the weight of what hovered in the air, while Caleb's hands, big and calloused from years of honest work, hesitated at the knot beneath her chin because the stain. Sack was not just cloth, but a boundary between what he could still believe about this world and what he feared he already knew. Her hair clung to her temples with sweat, her eyes downcast not in shame but exhaustion, and in her stillness there was a stubborn will that reminded him of the land itself, how it refused mercy yet endured. And as he reached forward he heard his own thoughts betraying him, warning him that some things, once seen, could not be uncarried, could not be put back into the dark. He loosened the knot slowly, every fiber of him aware of the sound it made, the soft scrape of burlap against skin, the faint tremor that ran through her shoulders as if she were bracing for a blow that never came. And when the sack slid free into his hands, it was heavier than it should have been, wrong in a way that made his stomach knot, and the weight of it pulled his gaze down despite himself, despite the way she turned her face away, as if sparing him might spare herself. Inside were small boots, a pair no longer than his forearm, cracked leather scuffed at the toes, and beneath them a folded calico dress stiff with old mud. And for a long moment Caleb could not breathe, because the past came rushing back with the force of a stampede. Memories of his daughter's shoes lying by the door, of laughter that once lived in his house before sickness and bad seasons and quieter tragedies took it all, and the desert wind moaned low as if mourning alongside him. She spoke then, her voice barely holding together, telling him without looking that they'd been taken weeks ago from a wagon train gone wrong, that she'd been told to forget their names if she wanted to live, that she had carried those things through heat and cold and cruelty because letting them go felt like letting go of the last proof that love had ever existed, and Caleb felt anger rise not hot and wild but cold and exact, the kind that settles into a man and waits, shaping his future, whether he invites it or not. He wanted to ask her name but didn't, sensing that names mattered too much right now, sensing that whatever had broken her had also sharpened her. And as he wrapped the sack back closed with care, as though tucking something precious to rest, he realized the land itself had set this meeting in motion, that all his years of isolation and regret had led him to this exact place and hour, and that survival was never just about staying alive, but about choosing what you were willing to carry forward. He told her she was safe for the night, that his ranch lay just beyond the ridge, and when she finally looked up at him, there was no gratitude in her eyes, only a question heavy, as the sack had been, a question about whether safety was a lie. Men told when they didn't yet know the cost, and as thunder rolled far off where the sky bruised purple, Caleb understood that by opening that sack, he had opened something else too, something that would not be tied shut again. And as they started toward the horses, the desert swallowing their footprints behind them, he felt the unmistakable pull of destiny tightening like a noose, promising that whatever came next would demand more than he had left, and that neither of them would walk away unchanged. The night took them in without mercy, the ranch house rising from the dark like a tired old sentinel, and Caleb did not speak as he cut the ropes from her wrists and set a bowl of water by the stove, because some silences were earned and others were necessary, and she drank slowly, as if relearning trust one swallow at a time, while the sack rested on the table between them like a witness that refused to leave. And when dawn finally crept through the cracked windows, it found two people bound together, not by choice but by consequence. Because the men who had done this did not forget loose ends, and Caleb knew before the dust even rose on the horizon that trouble was riding hard toward him. They came mid-morning, three of them, lean and sun-hardened, with eyes that measured life in profit and inconvenience, claiming she was stolen property, claiming a reward had been paid and lost, claiming the law would see things their way. And Caleb listened with the same stillness he used when breaking a wild horse, because fear never taught obedience, only patience did. And when he told them to leave, his voice carried the weight of a man who had already buried everything worth threatening. The first shot split the air like a verdict, and the desert answered with chaos as horses screamed and men scattered, dust choking the sky while Caleb moved not fast but certain, each pull of the trigger guided by the same hand that once rocked a fevered child through the night. And when the gun smoke cleared, two men lay still, and the third fled into the open, taking with him whatever lies he planned to sell in the next town. She stood frozen in the doorway, the sack clutched to her chest, watching a future close behind her, and another crack open in front, and Caleb saw in her eyes that she understood now the cost of staying, the blood price that clung to him like the land itself. He expected her to run when the bodies were buried and the sun dipped low again, because survival had taught her motion, not roots, but instead she stepped closer and asked him if he believed the world still owed him anything. And the question struck deeper than a bullet because it forced him to look at the truth he'd been avoiding, that he had stayed alive not for hope, but for habit, not for love, but for endurance. That night she told him her name was Eliza Monroe, and names, once spoken, changed things. And she told him about the children, not as victims, but as lights that had once existed, about laughter stolen but not erased. And Caleb listened until the ache became something bearable, something that could be carried without breaking the spine. Days passed, and then weeks, the ranch settling into a rhythm shaped by two wounded souls, learning how to share space without flinching. And Eliza worked the land not to forget, but to remember herself. While Caleb found that the silence he'd worshipped for years had finally grown too loud, replaced now by footsteps and breath, and the soft human proof that fate had not finished with him yet. When the law finally arrived, slow and reluctant as it always was, Caleb did not hide, did not lie, and the sheriff, a man older than justice and younger than regret, listened to the story with eyes that had seen too much to pretend innocence was common, and in the end, he left with a warning instead of chains, because some battles ended before they reached paper. Eliza stood beside Caleb as the dust settled, the sack now buried beneath a lone cottonwood where the earth could hold what hands no longer could. And she did not cry, because grief had already taken enough from her, but she placed her palm over the fresh soil and whispered a goodbye that sounded more like a promise than a farewell. Seasons turned, the land forgiving nothing yet offering enough, and the ranch became something other than a graveyard of memory, becoming instead a place where broken people could stand without bowing. And Caleb realized one quiet evening as the sun bled into the hills that destiny was not the hand that took from you, but the one that stayed open afterward, waiting to see what you would place inside it. Eliza chose to stay not because she had nowhere else to go, but because she finally had somewhere she was not owned by her past. And Caleb chose to live not out of stubbornness, but because love, even wounded and late, had found him again and demanded witness. And so this story ends not with redemption neatly wrapped, but with two souls still walking forward under a wide and unforgiving sky. Proof that survival is not the absence of pain, but the decision to rise anyway. And if this tale stirred something in you, if the dust and destiny of the Wild West still speak to your heart, then remember that stories like this live on through those who listen, who believe, and who stand with us. So ride with Western Destiny Tales. Subscribe to the channel and keep these forgotten paths alive, because as long as stories are told, fate has not had the final word. Verse